All right, I've just put my speakerphone or my earphones on. Is that working?
Not yet.
What about now?
Yep, we got you now. Thank you.
Okay, so you can all hear me. All right, I'll go through that again. Thank you. So I'll do all that again. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you folks are, and welcome to this live session on human origins. I, of course, am your professor, Don Johanson. I recently got back from Africa and happy to be back home, but had a wonderful time on safari in Eastern Africa. We don't have a great number of questions today, but some enthusiastic questions from students. And our first, well, anyway, first of all, I hope you're enjoying the course. I got some positive comments from some of you, which makes me happy to know that I'm being well received out there in this course. Our first question today comes from Sarah, Cerys, and as an avid Lord of the Rings fan, I was intrigued to find out hobbits really existed. Please discuss the discovery of Homo floresiensis, excavated from Flores Island, Indonesia, and how it shook up the anthropological world, and characteristics of this species compared to early apes, humans, and modern-day humans. Show pictures with your explanation, please. Well, I'm not going to be able to show pictures, but in the course, we do address Homo floresiensis with a number of photographs. I have seen the original specimens. I traveled to the end of the, as Alfred Russel Wallace called it, the Malay Archipelago, what we call Indonesia today, out to that one of the easternmost islands known as Flores, a place that is not very frequently visited by people who do go to Indonesia. Mostly people are fascinated to go there to learn more about Homo erectus that was found in 1891 on Java, and also, of course, to see the orangutans, the poor orangutans in Borneo that are under such incredible pressure, just simply to survive. Conservation, one of my passions, another issue, but it is a place, Borneo, there are only two areas where they're in Sumatra, where orangutans live. We know they lived in a much greater geographical area because we find lots of fossil orang teeth in China. for example, that were sold in apothecary stores, drugstores, supposedly as dragon teeth to be used in medicine. But Indonesia is an incredibly diverse, very interesting place to go to. And in the fall of 2004, a Indonesian Australian team, led largely by a man named Peter Brown, were doing excavations in a cave known as Liang Bua, or LB for short. And during the course of excavations, they found rudimentary stone tools. These are enormous caves. I visited Liang Bua, and it is an enormous cave. I mean, you could hide airplanes in there. It's so big. And very moist soil. And what was preserved was a partial skeleton that was dated at that time as being considered to be very recent, although the dating now has changed considerably. While I was there with Peter, not Peter, but with a former student of ours who's overseeing the research there with a number of Indonesian colleagues, particularly an Indonesian geologist, we looked at details of the strata, the stratigraphy, and there were some correlation problems that they've now worked out. And the date has been pushed back considerably to about 50,000 years, when probably the last Homo floresiensis lived and went extinct. Well, at any rate, there were folk stories on Flores about little people that came out of the forest. They were upright walking, and they had a strange little speech and so on. It was a folk tale. But here was a skeleton, very short in stature, and from the teeth and the maturation of the bones, that is the biological development of the bones themselves, that this was an adult individual, only about 3.5 feet tall. Reminiscent, of course, of Lucy, the famous discovery from Ethiopia. The skeleton had a very small brain, about chimpanzee size, which is about the size of Lucy's cranium. But it didn't have a projecting face like Lucy. It had a flatter face. It had thin cranial bones. It in some ways looked like, in certain aspects, the genus Homo. There's been a great deal of debate about whether or not it should have gone into a new genus. Some people even think it should go into Australopithecus. I don't think that's the case. But it really electrified paleoanthropology for a number of reasons. Because of this odd combination of apparently being able to make stone tools, had a very small brain, perhaps hunted these dwarf elephants known as stegodon. There is a process in biology known as island dwarfing, where animals compete in a much more confined and smaller area, which means that large-sized animals, like a regular-sized elephant, would have a hard time surviving there. The elephants that survived were the ones that were smaller in stature and demanded less natural resources, from food to space to water, etc. So there would have been a selection for smaller sized elephants. Those would be the ones that would leave the most genes in the next population. So there are examples of this in the Mediterranean, off the coast of California, that mammals tend to be dwarfed in size. So the obvious connection was that maybe large-sized Homo erectus, in the strict sense of Homo erectus, like Java man, got there and underwent a dwarfing. Well, certainly the brains of Homo erectus were 800 to 1,000 cc's. You wouldn't expect the brains to shrink also with body size, especially in animals that were making and using stone tools, perhaps even cooking food. There are some burned remains that suggest that. But what is interesting is that no one would have predicted that we would find on an island like this something that has picked up the name The Hobbits. And by the way, the people who made those films do not like it when people refer to them on public stage as hobbits, because they feel that they own that name. But at any rate, these diminished creatures in terms of size, they had peculiar wrist bones, they had peculiar long feet flopping along, but they did survive. They did live there. And I think what is really intriguing to me about this is that, first of all, that humans got to this island, and whether they did this by island hopping, or I don't think they were boats. Did they do this at a time when the sea level was low and they could hop across, or did they go on floating vegetation or whatever? But was that they became isolated there. I think that's a feature of Homo floresiensis that many people don't consider. This happened in another place, which we all know of as Madagascar. And we all think of lemurs as these little, small, cuddly things. Some of them fit in the palm of your hand. Some of them are, more cat size or dog size. But when people excavated in caves on Madagascar, they found giant lemurs. Lemurs, and Madagascar is a much, much bigger island than Flores, so bear that in mind. But they found giant lemurs. And these giant lemurs were the size of female gorillas, like Megalodopus, for example, and others. I think I've talked about those a little bit when we talked about primate diversity. And nobody objected to that. They said, well, okay, this is an odd thing. They got isolated there. And because they didn't have any natural predators, they could increase in size. And I say this because if you looked at lemurs today, before the discovery of these large lemurs, you would not expect to see giant gorilla-sized lemurs, right? So when this specimen, LB1, Liangbua 1, was brought to the public's eye and published in a reputable scientific, well-refereed journal, means that this discovery was adjudicated, and scientists of note weighed in on the veracity, the truthfulness of this discovery. People were pretty surprised. And they didn't quite know what to make of it. Some people thought these were dwarfs. Well, they don't. The face is not the face of a dwarf. It's a diminished hominin face. Okay. The teeth are a little strange, but they're small. There are stone tools with them, and so on. So were they a diminished version of Homo erectus? I don't think so. I postulated in my last book, Lucy's Legacy, that perhaps this was Homo habilis that got out of Africa before anybody ever thought that was possible. Animals do wander around, and there are millions of years at stake here, right? And over millions of years, people can move, animals can move very long distances, right? So the Flores material is very exciting because it gives us, I think, a snapshot of a population of hominins that became isolated on an island and underwent a kind of independent evolution, separate from other populations of hominins. You could look at Neanderthals the same way, of course, that Neanderthals were more or less isolated in Europe, in Southwest Europe and Siberia, and underwent independent evolution from Homo sapiens in Africa. Didn't prevent some level of interbreeding later on, but crafted under the influence of natural selection creatures. I don't have a Neanderthal skull around here. I think I have fragments of one here somewhere. But the beetle-browed, very pulled-out face, flattened, long cranium, big sinuses, all of those features that were adapted to a glacial, periglacial, cold environment. So natural selection at these early stages of human evolution had a very profound effect. We'll return to that later when we talk about where artificial selection is going today. And it is my sense, and I think the sense of most of my colleagues, that a population of sufficient size, so it wasn't just one or two people who got there, underwent independent natural selection. And that these creatures really have nothing to do with evolving into modern humans. Frequently, people who find fossils want to see their fossil be the ancestor. Oh, this has got to be the ancestor that led to us. I have found the earliest ancestor for modern humans. And they don't very interestingly, they don't try to understand those creatures in the world in which they lived and evolved. We see this in a number of different areas. Recent fossil discoveries from South Africa that were supposed to be millions and millions of years old. Homo naledi was immediately touted as an ancestor to modern humans. This was our ancestor because it was 3 million years old. It looked very Homo-like. Well, in fact, it turns out they're only about 300,000 years old. And they are probably Homo naledi from South Africa that Berger and his team unearthed, is probably another wonderful example of what happens when populations of any kind of animal, but in this case, hominids, become isolated from other hominins. And I think that South Africa is that cul-de-sac, like Flores at the end of Indonesia, is they couldn't go any further. And they didn't go back. Maybe some did, maybe we don't have the remains. And that under independent natural selection, under very different conditions, different species, different kinds of hominins arise. It also means that as recently as 50,000 years ago, let's say 100,000 years ago, we had Homo sapiens in Africa. We had Homo naledi, right? We had Homo neanderthalensis. We had Homo erectus. We had Denisovans from Asia. And we had Homo floresiensis. And what this is telling us is that, like other family trees of any sorts of animals, there is independent evolution in many areas that lead to different species. Today, we are one. We are alone. There is one hominin species on the planet. And of course, that is all of you and me and everybody we know. And we are all Homo sapiens, right? That's because the barriers, the water barriers, the geographic barriers, the ecological barriers, etc., to gene flow have all been taken away. That anybody on the planet can interbreed with anybody else on the planet and produce new members of our species. But when you look back even 50,000 years ago, okay, Homo sapiens in Africa was certainly on its way and present in Asia. And it may be that by 50,000 years, they did enter. There are indications, of course, that they entered Australia certainly by that time, or maybe even earlier, that when they came to and populated places like Flores, that is when Floresiensis went extinct. So I think if you get anything out of this example of independent, separate, isolated evolution, it's the fact that it can happen even among humans. It doesn't happen today because all those barriers are broken down. Somebody can get on an airplane in Sydney, Australia, and fly to Los Angeles and marry someone, or vice versa, and have children. So that genes are flowing everywhere. And we know from various biological studies that it doesn't take a lot of gene flow to keep us all sort of on the same species, in the same species. So I suspect, I know that one of our former students from Arizona State University is working in at Liang Bua with his Indonesian colleagues, and there will be more discoveries, no doubt, and there will be perhaps more surprises about the anatomy, which is fascinating, and that's the other interesting thing. When you look at the anatomy, it doesn't fit anything else. It doesn't fit Homo sapiens. It doesn't fit Homo erectus. It doesn't fit Homo habilis. It doesn't fit Australopithecus. So it's something unique. You can argue whether it should have been a new genus, okay, or it's certainly a new species. Whether or not it should have been named a new genus is talked about extensively. It's not a diseased individual because it doesn't show signs of disease. It's not a microcephalic dwarf, for example. But you need to look at it in this framework of time, geography, ecology, and natural selection. And realize that these individuals that we call Homo floresiensis, and you can't get more isolated than Flores, believe me. I've been there. It's a beautiful island, by the way. That strange things happen. And I think that's what we're seeing in other discoveries like this, such as those I mentioned that are placed in Homo naledi. They're a strange amalgam of what are, sometimes called ancestral and derived, or primitive and modern. It's because given different conditions, ecological conditions, given different aspects of, say, of founder population and things that we talked about before that influence how animals evolve, that it's a classic example of a creature that evolved independently and went in its own evolutionary direction and developed this strange, I like to use the word amalgam, of features that make it different from everything else. And one should not try to force those things into being our ancestor. One should really step back and look at what that variation is telling us in terms of taxonomy, in terms of what they should be called, in terms of behavior, in terms of functional anatomy. And then you are really rewarded with a better understanding of this incredible force of natural selection that Darwin, in the last page of his Origin of Species, could be so remarkably creative in terms of its diversity, just like the lemurs of Madagascar, for example. Now, and by the way, Saris, thank you very much. Oh, yeah, here's another question. I'm also curious about the more recent discovery, and there was something in the news even more recently about the fossil discovery in Israel. Yes, this was by colleagues like Hershkowitz and others, that there was a fragment of upper jaw. And it was found quite a number of years ago, but it's only more recently that dating techniques to establish its antiquity at 170,000 years, for example, have been possible. And this upper jaw is got teeth in it, as you probably saw, clearly belongs in the genus Homo, okay, from the anatomy of that arch that can be more or less reconstructed, the size of the teeth, the anatomy of the area below the nose, and so on. And it looks like it could reasonably be placed into the genus Homo and into the species Sapiens. Now, I've talked about this before, and I just want to reiterate that what I see happening in paleoanthropology is that during the initial stages of my career, in the late 60s and through the 70s and even into the 80s and 90s, there has been a real focus on earlier stages of human evolution. Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, Auroran, Sahelanthropus coming under interesting fire again about a femur that was found associated with it, and whether or not this was really upright walking and so on. But there are a number of genera that people have talked about, and looking for more ancient discoveries. Now, I think partially with the advent of the ability to draw DNA out of bones of especially Neanderthals and early modern Homo sapiens in Europe and elsewhere, that there has been an increasing interest in the origins of us, meaning Homo sapiens. And people are looking at sites, they're going back to them. You heard not long ago my colleague Jean-Jacques Goubert at the Max Planck Institute looked at this wonderful site in Morocco that he had always wanted to go back and look at. And they've developed dating there. They've got it's almost 300,000 years, and they have Homo sapiens. They have a very good cranium. A skull, part of a skull, most of a skull. And no one's argued with that assessment of its taxonomy. And it means that Homo sapiens, which we have traditionally thought about because of discoveries in Eastern Africa, particularly where I've worked in Ethiopia, in southern Ethiopia at Kibish, that they were maybe 190,000 years old. And that was the earliest sapiens. Well, just because that's the oldest discovery doesn't mean it's the first appearance of that species. So, sure enough, when they redated the material in Morocco and found it to be 300,000 years old, it meant that our own species, right, Homo sapiens, goes back much further in time. So, this suggests that in Israel, which has been the crossroads, as a colleague of mine once called it, it's sort of like a bus station, people going in and out into Europe, out of Europe, into Africa, out of Africa, into the Middle East, out of the Middle East, into Asia, out of Asia, into Africa. That it's like the crossroads. It's been the crossroads for cultures and religions and people and spices and whatever. Why was it not the same for humans? So it just means we had sapiens there at about 90,000, 100,000 years. This adds another 3/4 of a million, 100,000 years. Okay. And so it's not terribly surprising. It's just wonderful to look at this in the context of the emphasis that people have on the specific times and places and occurrences of our own species, Homo sapiens. So if you've got Homo sapiens at 300,000 years in Morocco, you've got it at 200,000 years in Ethiopia, you've got it at 175,000 years in Israel, things like proposed ancestors such as Homo naledi are just too late at 300,000 years. It's not a modern Homo sapiens. It's clearly a different species and an example of what geographic separation can do. Okay. So it just means that we have extended back in time. Now, it has raised among a number of colleagues, and we're just beginning to see this in the literature. What is, how do we define Homo sapiens? It may sound like a strange question because we use it every day. We are Homo sapiens. How do we define ourselves? Anatomically, because it's very difficult to sort of define Homo sapiens on the basis of what's going on in here. All right. Language and so on. We can see proxies in terms of paintings and tools and so forth. And it brings up an ancient um, perspective. For many years in paleoanthropology in France, particularly, there was a suggestion that we were Homo sapiens sapiens, that we are doubly smart, meaning that we are a subspecies of sapiens. That's what sapiens sapiens is. And that, yes, they said Neanderthals are different, but are they that different to be a different species, meaning that they don't interbreed? And we now know from the work of genetics that any of you listening, and certainly me, have a certain level of Neanderthal genes in our genome. And it means there was some level of interbreeding. So, are we going to return to splitting sapiens into different subspecies? We've seen that happen already with fossils from Ethiopia, from a site known as Hairtu. And there are complete crania of adults and infants, and yet they're more heavily built than we are. They've got big cranial capacity and so forth, so on. But the people who announced that, Tim White from Berkeley and his collaborators, uh, called it Homo sapiens idaltu. So is that door open a crack now for kind of looking at subspecies of our own species, sapiens? So I think we're going to see more discussion of that. You heard it here first. um, Lovely email from Clariana Marquez, uh, and she's very happy to be able to participate in this, what she calls an evolutionary debate, and talks about artificial selection in the evolution of species. She's read Harari's recent book, Homo Deus, which I have not yet read, but he does speculate that we're going to resort, and I don't think it's really speculation. I think that it's clear. If we're manipulating the genes of animals and plants, it's only natural that we'll be doing this to ourselves. And sort of upgrade, she says, and she puts that in quotes, which is very acceptable, to prolong life expectancy. Life expectancy. Some people say the mega rich have one thing that they can't achieve, and that is to live for 200 years. Well, it's very possible that there may be a genetic, there certainly is a genetic basis for aging. And in some places, people live longer than other places. Part of it is probably nutrition, but part of it is probably genetic. So maybe we can live to be 150. We've got so many people on the planet; it raises so many issues of who gets to live that long. How do you choose that person to live that long? What happens to all the people who don't have access to that? There are ethical issues that will certainly be approached. We know that there is some level of genetic influence on certain abilities. I'm not trying to be a total genetic determinist, but I know that I could have been schooled in becoming a baseball pitcher, and never have even gotten close. I'm a terrible thrower. Okay, anatomical, but probably much of that anatomy is determined by genetics. Sociobiology is a very, very controversial area. But the point is that if we can manipulate plants to have higher levels of the production of, say, wheat or corn or whatever, there is a genetic basis for that. There's hybrid vigor, bringing two strains together, and so forth and so on. The idea of artificial selection, of course, I'm sure Clariana, sorry, I don't exactly how to pronounce that name, but that this was initially what, in many ways, sparked the 19th century evolutionists. And this is very clear with Darwin, with pigeon breeding and dog breeding and horse breeding and cow breeding and so on, that you can select features that you find favorable. Whether or not natural selection does or not, we don't know. Some people say that we have so narrowly selected for productivity in some of our domesticated animals and plants that there's very little variability for natural selection to choose or act on if there is a major attack on that species. And that may be very dangerous. We grow kind of like one kind of potato. In South America, if you go to Peru, which I have done, there is a multitude of different potatoes that are not necessarily different species, but have different strengths and different weaknesses. So that if a particular disease affects one particular genetic profile, uh, others will survive. Now, I don't think it's going to have a profound influence on our species. I don't think it's going to cause us to speciate, to evolve into different species. Okay. I think you really need long term isolating events under different ecological settings and selective pressures, as they're called. And I've talked about this in the course, and I've also said, yes, if Elon Musk sends people into space, or NASA, or the Chinese space program, or wherever, and the people on that mission are isolated for 100,000 years, 200,000 years, 500,000 years, probably develop into a different species. I don't want to belabor this question. She also asks the same impact on population growth. Population growth has got to come under control. We have to limit somehow this species Homo sapiens that is out of reproductive control, or there will be a major catastrophe on this planet. I'd like to know your input. Rachel Orkin writes, I don't know if she's from South Africa. I once knew a family named Orkin. Like to know your input on bipedalism, what you think, how humans have now evolved to walk with a controlled fall. I'm not sure what that is, but I talk a great deal about bipedalism. And I appreciate you say you're elated to have an opportunity to talk about this question, and I'm so happy that you're reflecting and thinking about these things. Um, how humans have now evolved to walk with controlled fall, I don't know what that means. Uh, I've stepped out of a Land Rover and fallen flat on my bottom. I wouldn't call that a controlled fall. I think bipedalism does have its downfalls, as we talked about. It's pretty unstable. When I was in Africa this time, I never saw an elephant or an impala or a hyena or a kudu fall over. They got four legs in touch with the ground. Our bodies have adapted, as you know from my lectures on bipedalism, to a anatomy, a center of gravity, etc., balance in the ears, many aspects that have helped us be not only secure but efficient bipeds. There is a question about whether or not is DNA available from older hominins like Australopithecus. Now, would I like to see DNA from Australopithecus afarensis, from Lucy's bones? Yes, I would. Would I like to see DNA from these other creatures? Absolutely. But these fossils that are completely mineralized, turned to stone, simply do not have any organic material left in them. And at the moment, because science progresses and science changes and science sometimes solves problems that we don't think can be solved, we cannot get older DNA, which is very unfortunate. But this paleo DNA work, to be a paleogeneticist and to get DNA out of Neanderthals and out of late sapiens has allowed us to say more about the relatedness and interactions between Neanderthals and sapiens than we've gotten from the gross anatomy. You know, I work mostly at this macro scale. Geneticists work at a microscopic level. We know that Africa is the homeland, right? Because we all have African genes. We know that we were at some time, our ancestors were capable of exchanging genes with Neanderthals because we have Neanderthal genes in us. We know that I have higher levels of Scandinavian genes than someone from Nigeria, for example, because my more immediate ancestors lived in Scandinavia. There are genetic tests where you can take a swab from your mouth and send them into the Genographic Project at National Geographic or 23andMe, and they will look at your genetic profile and give you some insights into where your ancestors migrated from. And this is fascinating. And I think we're going to see the application of genetics. I mean, genetics is really. I remember when DNA was discovered and announced, and I didn't know enough at that time as a youngster about the impact it would make. But all humans, all animals on this planet, all plants on this planet have DNA in them that is built on the same framework. We have computers that are much different. Some of you are using PCs, and like me, some of you are using Macs, and there are different operating systems. But the operating system in life, living things on this planet, is all based on what we know of as DNA. And I think there's going to be increasing revelations about understanding human migrations and dispersals and disease and so forth and so on. Someone sends in a more complicated question here, more extensive. In the lectures, the term hominin seems to equate with upright walking. Yes. Our earliest evidence of, we've talked about what is it that makes us human. If you look at it anatomically speaking, the first thing we see really is upright walking. And perhaps reduction in canine size and the sort of sectorial, cutting and slicing that apes have. But yes, when we look at Auroran tugenensis, I've seen the original bones in Kenya. The femurs have this little groove on the back of them called an obturator externus groove, which is occasionally present in gorillas, but is always, I would say, almost always present in sapiens in upright walking. So they're considered at 6 million years to be bipeds. Whether or not they gave left descendants, whether or not they were the ancestor, that's very difficult to actually prove or demonstrate. But they were upright walkers. So that the earliest feature that seems to separate us is the ability to walk upright. And as you know, there are all kinds of answers as to why, what the benefits were of walking upright. Seems to have been a pretty successful adaptation when you look at how few apes there are on the planet and how many bipeds there are on the planet. Auroran doesn't really seem to be adapted to climbing in trees. Maybe it was. We look at Ardipithecus, and it shows a lot of tree climbing ability. And the pelvis shows some evidence of upright walking, but it has a big divergent toe. It's another example of how species rich the tree is. We don't know. It's controversial as to whether or not it was an ancestor to later things like afarensis or animensis. And I talk about that exclusively both in my last book and also in my lectures. So I was hoping you could clarify what the term hominid can and cannot include. It cannot include anything that is not bipedal at the moment. Okay. And that's the big question with Sahelanthropus from Chad, which is older than 6 million. Was it capable of upright walking? Or at what point you can say a species is definitely hominin as opposed to ape, and how it relates to the Linnaean classification? Well, it's just another level in the Linnaean classification. So while chimps and gorillas, but chimps probably more than gorillas, walk, and I did say facultatively, meaning from time to time bipedally, they're not hominids. They don't, this is not their dedicated, anatomically designed mode of locomotion. Okay. And so they shouldn't be classified as hominids. They're classified as hominids that include chimps and humans, apes and humans. So hominins and apes are mutually exclusive. Okay. I hope that clears that up somewhat. We're sort of at the end of our questions. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to talk about right now. But I hope in this 45 minutes or so, it's almost an hour, it's 50 minutes, that we have had an opportunity, or you had an opportunity to see me, sort of, and hear me live, that I'm not so interested in the arguments of, how many species are there? Is this a different species? Whatever. But in trying to understand in the broad framework of evolutionary theory, in the I hope I'm back now, but in this broad evolutionary framework, much of which was unbelievably outlined by Darwin, that is the context in which we should be looking at human evolution. We shouldn't be so taken away by the oldest or the youngest or the most complete or the most confusing or the whatever, but to try to step back and to look at these discoveries in the broader, exciting framework of evolutionary theory. So thanks very much for listening. And I hope this was useful to those of you who have tuned in. And I want to thank all the students who took time to write in with questions and to give me an opportunity to kind of expand a little bit on some different topics that I may not have thoroughly covered in the lectures. So good luck to you. Enjoy the rest of the course, and just keep that mind open and receptive to understanding what this wonderful gift we all have as being alive and living in a very interesting and exciting world. All right. Thanks again. And bye for now.